Before we check into today's video, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed. It's totally free and allows you to never miss one of our stories. To put it generously, humans had a reputation. They were crazy. They were tough. They lacked the good sense to die when all logic said they should. However, despite the fear that humans tended to engender, most aliens didn't truly see them as dangerous. It was an interesting thing to note, because logically, humans should be frightening. The mammals could grow rather large, were born from a planet that most of the galaxy would have termed a living hell not long ago, and a good number still did, and were intimately acquainted with violence and death to a degree that no one outside of active duty military could claim. Not long after their first contact event, a barely shock-capable human commonwealth had fought the mighty war machine of the Dithrian Federation to a standstill, and debate still raged over if they would potentially have won had the war continued. The problem was, humans were friendly. As stated, on paper, humans should have been frightening. Those Dithrians who had faced humanity in combat and survived certainly thought so, watching in shock as wounded mammals moving solely due to adrenaline continued to kill their way through Federation lines until their lives were cut even shorter. Not even bleeding out was a guarantee of expedient death where humanity was concerned. But the humans had been excited to meet the Asav and Ekegs aboard the Planetary Survey Corps frigate, and their gregariousness had continued when they came for diplomatic missions and to petition for colonization rights. Despite the horrifying revelation that humans originated on a death world, a planet with a molten core, humans had been perfectly friendly even while their anecdotes left the aliens in the meeting traumatized. Perhaps the main reason why humans weren't widely considered dangerous was the simple fact that most people who had reason to consider them dangerous weren't around anymore to spread that opinion. It was this thought which swirled through Petty Officer Zavor's head as he made his rounds through the light cruiser Orion's Bow. Tall and broad for an Ekeg, his height and red scales would have made the three-eyed reptile an impressive specimen back home. On the Bow, while his red scales and the fact that he was an alien were topics of interest, he stood shorter than most of the male humans on the vessel. Zavor had served with the crew for several months now, as part of an exchange program of sorts. Those aliens who were hardy enough, who for obvious reasons were almost all military, were seconded to human ships, while humans were able to slot in anywhere. He'd heard some humans flippantly compare it to blood types, with humans as the universal donors. The concept made no sense to Zavor, but he was no doctor. In the time of his service, Zavor had watched the crew dispatch multiple threats with brutal efficiency. Orion's Bow was currently dispatched on a vague mission, essentially to patrol the theoretical border of the galaxy's southeastern fringe and offer assistance when called upon. As a hab ship, the cruiser was consummately equipped for such a long-term and loosely defined operation. The vessel could supply its own food, water, and oxygen through a complex system of looped hydroponics, and many of the lights provided ultraviolet to keep people healthy and keep the humans from becoming pallid. Mid-step, Zavor was thrown into the wall with such force that he ricocheted. Once he recovered his senses, he looked around to see lights flickering and screens glitching. This should have been impossible. Shock travel's mechanical aspects went over the Ekeg's head, but he knew that shocked ships didn't truly exist in the real world. Nothing should have been able to cause turbulence or an impact. Forcing himself to his feet even as the cruiser lurched around him, Zavor dashed toward the engineering bay. The alarms blared around them. Magira's clipped squawk informed the crew of an emergency exit from shock space. Zavor was surprised at just how thankful he was to hear Magira's voice and know she was still alive. The Dithrian woman was strange, more so than most Dithrians in Zavor's opinion. She had been raised among Nicti, and the harsh results-focused insectoid's behavior had rubbed off on her. Still, She was the only one on the ship who could truly understand the experience of being among true strangers. Even more exotic species, like the crustacean moritons, were at least known quantities, while humans hadn't been a recognized part of the galaxy for even a decade. On the bridge, Captain Trent Riley and his officers were in communication with the engineering room. The tall man, broad-shouldered but somewhat slim, ran a hand through his short-cropped black hair. His cobalt eyes flicked through various feeds, the normally blue lights from the bridge now an angry red, and making his dark blue uniform look purple in their harsh glow. "Do we know what hit us?" he asked in his deep baritone, trying to get a grasp on the overall situation while the lieutenant and commander worked with the helmsman to prepare for shock exit. Bagheera clicked her short, parrot-like beak and then shook her head. Raised among Nycti, many of the four-eyed insectoid's gestures didn't translate to her own body language, so she'd been learning to adopt human motions, which were typically more feasible. Her fluffy white feathers were especially ruffled, so puffed up from stress that the gray and brown speckling disappeared within the white mass.
"No idea, Captain," she squawked. "From how the systems react, it was some kind of electrical anomaly, but I know of nothing like that occurring in shock space. The shock core is overtaxed. We need to cut its power as soon as possible."
Helmsman Barnett said a quiet prayer while Bagheera's voice echoed once more over the bow's PA system.
"Brace for turbulence. Exiting shock space in 10, 9.
Bagheera didn't reach 0. The shock core sputtered and died, and the artificial gravity briefly faltered as various systems rebooted. Everyone was lifted into the air before crashing back down, like an overweight child lifted by a careless and weak parent. The rippling quicksilver of shock space gave way to a tiny sliver of the void, but the majority of the viewable area was taken up by a pale gray planet. Commander Roald McBride was the first to react, his normally pink skin turning redder than his thick beard, rivaling Zavor's scales. "Shit!" He mashed his thick thumb into a nearby console. "All hands, brace for impact! Emergency positions!" Barnett screamed, a combination of fear and battle cry as he wrenched the controls. His feet worked the pedals while he struggled to adjust the approach angle. They were caught in the planet's gravity well and were going down, but the drive core on Orion's bow was still functional. Too much thrust in atmosphere could be catastrophic, but he could control their descent to some degree. Cross-referencing scans that the crew were desperately forwarding, Barnett steered the cruiser toward an enormous body of water. The presumable ocean was hopefully deep enough that the bow could splash down and resurface. Thousands of tons of armored vessel impacted the water at just enough of an angle that it didn't immediately split in half, but the splashdown was still violent. Anyone who'd managed to make it to an emergency harness was simply thrown around, likely to have nothing worse than bruises and sprains. Those who weren't so lucky were hurled across open space, crashing into walls or consoles. The crew would be tallying casualties and fatalities while they took stock of the damage the cruiser had suffered. Dim red lights illuminated the hallways, the warship running on emergency power until it could be ascertained that the reactor was undamaged. While the tall, pale blonde Lieutenant Danica Kellen rushed for medical supplies, and the broad Commander McBride pulled people from the wreckage of their stations, Riley stared intensely at the screen for the engineering bay. Eventually, as the lights came back on, the transmission flickered to life. Bagheera looked a little worse for the wear, clearly jostled, her feathers somehow even more puffed.
"Bagheera, status report," Riley demanded. "Are we in any danger?"
Another human-inspired shake of the head.
"No, Captain. From what I can see, the reactor is fine. We'll have to make sure no wiring was damaged, but I don't see any hull breaches or loss of internal integrity. It's a miracle, but we seem to have survived. The drive core is overtaxed and will need at least a day of no use in order to avoid damaging it."
Riley gritted his teeth.
"And the shock core?"
"Shut!"
came the near-immediate reply.
reached,
Megara continued.
but the reaction stopped outright.
The communications officer, Alvarez, made her feelings on the situation known. God damn it! Opting to ignore the outburst in the context of a crisis, Riley asked the logical next question.
When will it be ready?
Megara held her taloned hands on either side of her head, one of the few Dithrian gestures she still used reflexively, the shrug learned from her parents.
The reactant stones are still intact, so we just need to wait for them to build up a charge. It would be presumptuous of me to give an estimate, but based on the current energy passively generated, I'd suppose a month or so.
McBride spoke up.
A month? The crew will go stir crazy, sir.
Riley rolled his eyes slightly. He knew, but it was still irritating to hear.
Duly noted. Alvarez, get E-War working with Intel and see what we can find out about this planet. Is the air breathable, the gravity tolerable, etc.? I want the basic rundown in 3 hours.
He rose from his seat.
Kellen, Zavor, get some Marines together. If the planet's livable, I expect the crew will want to get off the bow and spend some time puttering around on the surface. Best to get some people who know about camping to start. McBride, as usual, if we leave the ship, then the bow is in your hands.
Without further word, Captain Riley headed out of the bridge and on his way toward the engineering bay. Riley was a hands-on commanding officer, preferring to meet his crew face-to-face rather than over a screen. The reinforced doors hissed open, permitting him entry. The engineering crew wore drab yellow insulation suits over their uniforms, the classic boiler suits able to expand and cover their extremities in the event of a crisis. Yellow bobbed back and forth, and in the middle of the chaos, rather like a fluffy statue, was Megara. The Dithrian's feathers had not gone back to their usual packed-down contours, stress leaving her frazzled and fluffed. It had been difficult convincing the crew to accept a Dithrian aboard, and even Riley had been disinclined until he learned that she was unconventional, to say the least. Most Dithrians were haughty and aggressive, bullies secure in their martial prowess. The fact that they could crush any other individual galactic nation, at least until the advent of humanity, did little to disabuse them of this behavior. Megara's aggression only came to the surface against mechanical or mathematical problems. She was downright non-confrontational with other people. Being raised among Nicti had blunted most of her species' bad behaviors, replacing them with other bad behaviors that didn't rankle as much, because the crew hadn't seen their friends and family slaughtered by four-eyed insectoids. Megara hadn't once been referred to as a Spenguin by the crew, and once her savant-like prowess for starship engineering had been revealed, the rest of the bay's crew had happily let her take charge.
So,
Riley opened as he approached Megara. Dithrians were in general larger than the average human, and she and Riley were at eye level with one another.
Do we have any idea what happened to fry us?
Another talon shrug was Megara's reply.
Unclear, Captain. My only certainty thus far is that it was not a targeted attack. I have wondered, since our deployment here to the Fringe, why is it that this section of the galaxy has gone untamed? A propensity of death worlds seems to be one aspect, but that should have been on record rather than a recent discovery. I begin to suspect that incidents such as this one were the cause of so many ships getting lost in the Fringe. Most vessels are not equipped for long-term sustainability. A crash, even one where the vessel remained intact, would necessitate rationing.
And rationing would lead to tensions, nervousness about scarcity.
Riley continued her point.
And that would lead to mutiny, which at best would result in the crew simply stealing the ship, since they know they can't return home as mutineers.
He let out a soft huff of air.
So, do we have any way to get the shock core up and running faster?
Megara nodded.
Possibly. Once the intelligence teams have data for us, we can sift through it. If we're fortunate, we can find something else reactive to agitate the stones.
The shock drive was the universal faster-than-light engine of the galaxy, powered in a manner similar to alchemy by the near-supernatural reaction between special stones. Other elements could add to their charge, but they were rare, and only the most important of ships carried extras. There was also the fact that these reactants were highly volatile in general, and thus dangerous to keep aboard a starship. Riley nodded.
Update me the moment you have something.
Several hours later, Trent Riley sat in his office sipping a rum cocktail. He kept some of the classic sailor's drink for quiet occasions, and waiting for feedback was one such. The captain also wanted to distract himself from the tragedy. They had lost 14 hands in the impact, and another 50 were severely injured and remanded to medbay. His communicator chirped, and Riley opted to answer it at his console. Lieutenant Alvarez's husky voice came through as the screen resolved to show the darkly tanned woman.
Captain, we have information. Most of it is good news, some bad. Engineering is sorting through our data for more pertinent results.
She took a breath.
The planet has gravity slightly higher than that of Earth, about 1.5 times. Armor servers should easily be able to compensate. Atmosphere is breathable. A bit higher nitrogen concentration, but it should only feel like we're at a high altitude. Overall, the planet seems livable at least for a short stay.
Riley nodded his head to the side.
All right. And the bad news?
The planet has numerous active volcanoes, and the water has toxically high sulfur content. If we wanted to supply hydroponics to our canteens, we'd need to make sure we have quality filters and be willing to lose at least a few in the exchange.
Alvarez paused.
We've also got blips on our sensors.
That brought the captain up short.
How sensitive?
Normal,
came Alvarez's reply. Orion's bow was theoretically capable of narrowing its sensors to detect presences human-sized or smaller, particularly as a subset of its electronic warfare suite. However, that was taxing on the equipment. The default sensor sweep detected things roughly the size of a starfighter, or an ordinary human sedan, planet-side.
Fighter size?
Riley wanted to hope that at least it was the bare minimum.
Bomber, at least. Some bigger. Nothing like an actual warship, but some would pass for small freighters.
Since Alvarez hadn't mentioned any transmissions, they were all but guaranteed to not be dealing with the technologically capable people making use of transportation. This meant megafauna, many of which were far larger than the biggest land animals on Earth. Riley regarded Alvarez, noting the way she bit her lip.
You're holding something back. What's the worst news?
The lieutenant had the good grace to flush in embarrassment at being called out.
There's some kind of atmospheric interference and organic jamming. Our scanners could punch through it, but anything without the bow's power won't be able to transmit far. Headset range will be a non-starter, and even max power in our comms suites won't travel more than a click.
The captain exhaled through his teeth, a sharp hissing sound.
That discounts setting up external camps. This is starting to sound like a pre-SEF movie.
The Space Exploration Force had been established upon the refinement of the shock drive. Before then, humanity had been restricted to their solar system, and had invented stories about what the rest of the galaxy might be like. His communicator chirped again.
Write up anything else pertinent. I'm getting a call from engineering.
Riley flicked the transmission over to see Magira, the avian's feathers finally settling back down into their normal packed-down form.
I hope you have good news for me.
Potentially, Captain, she squawked. Intel scans showed me small amounts of Earth blood in some of these mobile blips.
Riley was confused for a moment before he remembered that Earth blood was the translation for one of the volatile elements that could react with shock stones.
Enough to significantly reduce our charge time?
At the Dithrian's affirmation, he gave a morose smirk.
And let me guess. It's only noticeable in the biggest ones.
How did you know, Captain?
He chuckled.
Because I've seen this movie before.
Leaving her confused, he continued.
If you can rig up some sort of detector that doesn't rely on typical sensors, or has enough oomph to get through the natural jamming, do so. Might as well go see what we're dealing with before we decide if we're hunting it.
Cutting the transmission with engineering, Riley opened a wide-band communication across the ship.
Attention, Orion's bow. This is Captain Trent Riley. We're at a decision point, one that I cannot in good faith make by myself. Under normal circumstances, our shock core will take at least a month to spool back up to functionality. Until then, we're stuck in this system. However, engineering has discovered that freighter-sized megafauna contain elements within them that would charge the core much more quickly. If enough of you are willing to come hunting monsters, we'll collect the catalysts. If you'd rather stay here and not risk life and limb for no real profit except for time, that's also acceptable.
Nearly all of the Bose Marines had volunteered to go hunting, so Riley had to narrow things down. He decided that a 6-person team would be best for scouting, and then, once they'd figured out how and whether they would deal with the beasts, the team would return to collect a larger contingent of Marines. Despite the fact that Riley often referred to Kellen as "My Gal Friday," a phrase that Zavor still didn't understand, he'd insisted that the multi-talented woman remain shipboard to help with administration and maintain morale. McBride was a good leader, but a stern man, and the aftermath of the crash would require a gentle touch to counterbalance. Captain Riley had selected Zavor to come along mostly to wrangle Magira. The engineer had insisted on being there in person to direct extraction of the Earthblood, and had jury-rigged a tracking device in record time. The thing was essentially a large compass, its arrow formed from a reactive sliver of shockstone. Shockstone often resonated with reactive materials, and so the arrow would turn toward the greatest source of Earthblood, pulled toward it. As pressure was applied to the pole anchoring the arrow in place, it made a soft boop noise. The remaining 3 people were all Marines, veteran squad leader LaSalle, survivalist Carver, and fight-happy Turnbull, who was the single largest man on the crew. The humans of the squad were clad in classic Commonwealth armor, a black bodysuit with white plating, white helmet with black reflective visor. Magira fit well enough into a human suit, but Ekeg physiology was not quite so accommodating. Zavor's standard-issue conglomerate armor had been repainted black and white, and fitted with a human communications suite, for all the good that would do them on this rock. The team had opted to bring extra equipment in case they encountered particularly stubborn obstacles. Self-ascending grappling hooks, a collection of grenades, and each human was equipped with a retractable, explosive-tipped spear. According to Carver, the spear was humanity's ultimate weapon, the one from which all other weapons technology originated. Zavor didn't know if he believed the scarred man, but he was willing to entertain the idea. The spears were for multiple purposes, anything from securing ropes to actually serving as melee weapons. The explosive tips were a holdout from cavalry charges against armored vehicles, and were still effective against modern vehicles. Or megafauna. The team headed out, clustered around Magira and her booping device. The planet simply felt unwelcoming. Everything seemed strangely washed out, colors not as vibrant as they should be. Mist inches thick clung to their ankles as they walked. Everything, including the mercury-colored water they had to cross in an escape raft to arrive on solid ground, leaned toward muted gray. There wasn't much in the way of flora, except for thick carpet-like clusters of tubers, and jagged rocks served the role that thick jungle foliage might have played on another planet. Magira's little compass was going berserk, applying more pressure to the anchor and making the little speaker boop faster accordingly.
It must be close.
The Dithrian squawked behind her blank faceplate. Carver held up a clenched fist before opening it, calling for the team to freeze and be silent. He stooped down, pressing a hand to the ground through inch-thick pea-soup mist that clung to the planet.
It's coming on my 10 o'clock.
He rasped through their internal link, a voice long since damaged by fires. At maximum transmission strength, they could at least talk to one another while nearby. The team took up positions hidden amid the staggered finger-like rocks, and soon enough everyone could hear the shaking ground. The creature that rounded the corner past the densest rock coverage was a true beast. The colossal insect was easily 2 stories tall, roughly the size of a house. Its carapace was matte black with mustard yellow accents, the monster shaped rather like a beetle. An enormous abdomen sheathed in elytra connected to a tiny thorax, and an enormous head that swept back and fluted like a triceratops' crest. Zavor couldn't see any eyes, but he could see a gaping maw, jagged with exoskeletal tooth substitutes rather than mandibles. Above that was a protruding horn that bent downward like a can opener. The thing trundled forward on 8 thick clawed legs, each footstep shaking the ground. It saw them and paused, clearly perplexed as to the presence of strange new creatures on its territory. After a moment or two, its sharp jaws opened, and the monster let out a horrific scream. It was not a roar or an animal bellow. The sound that emerged was akin to an enormous man wailing in agony. Riley shouldn't have had to give the order, but everyone reacts differently in the face of an unknown threat. "Move!" he boomed over their headset network, taking several shots at the thing's face to keep its attention. The team split organically into 3 groups, darting between the stone forests to avoid being crushed by the enormous predator. Zavor and Carver went in one direction, Magira and LaSalle another, and Captain Riley and Turnbull broke off in a third. The insectoid was originally going to pursue Turnbull and the captain, presuming them to be the meatiest meals due to being the biggest, but something in the way Zavor moved drew its attention. With the crew as a new and fascinating diversion from its usual life, the beast gave chase and tore through the stone forest. It used that strange horn, like a can opener or a sword, to rip apart the rocks in its way. It seemed that the stone was almost more like a form of coral. It could be presumed to grow organically, rebuilding each time creatures like this tore it down. The rocks slowing it down allowed the pair to outrun the insectoid, keeping ahead of its much longer stride as they made their way toward a canyon. With any luck, there would be a passage too tight for it to enter. Glancing back, Carver occasionally saw indigo beams tear through the air and sear burn marks into the monster's carapace, potshots from the rest of the crew, testing the beast's durability. More worrisome were the shots that hit its head or the elytra on its back. About half of them refracted off rather than finding their mark. The beetle did not stop when its prey reached the canyon. This stone world was its domain, and the rock yielded to its master. The hulking thing's flared head was as broad as the rest of its body, and as it entered the canyon, its armored head carved a divot in the sides of the stone channel, much like some sort of tunneling device.
Ah, shit!
Carver hissed through his fire-damaged vocal cords as he continued to puff air in a constant run. It was shocking to Zavor just how long humans could move without rest, and especially now. The reptile was beginning to lose steam, desperation unable to override his body's need to recharge. As he flagged, the monster behind him saw its chance. Flexing 6 of its legs, the beetle lunged forward. One of its frontmost limbs, a leg as thick as a Roman column and tipped with 2 claws like sharpened Jai-Alai cestas, lashed out and carved a trench through Zavor's back. The claw sheared effortlessly through the ablative ekeg plating, ripping off chunks as it found unprotected flesh. Worse still, as it tore open his side and split Zavor's red scales, it sliced apart the underweave designed to help ekeg blood to clot. Blue blood spilled freely from the reptile as he threw himself to the ground in desperation to avoid a second swipe. The creature let out another mannish yell, its bellow reverberating through the canyon, but the noise was quickly aborted. Carver spun, and with shocking accuracy, hurled an incendiary grenade into the beetle's jagged maw. The grenade detonated and flooded the beast's mouth and throat with flame, making it cough and stagger.
"That makes two of us!"
Carver couldn't resist the quip as he threw Zavor over his shoulder and dragged him further along. There was indeed a channel in the side of the canyon, a much smaller passageway in which they could hopefully hide.
"Come on, Red! Don't die on me!"
He shuffled down the side channel as far as he could before setting Zavor down deeper in, shielding the Ekeg with his own body while he withdrew some basic first aid spray. It wasn't much more than a sterile foam sealant, but hopefully it would keep his crewmate alive. They'd already lost enough people that day. While the beetle had been hampered, it seemed that the monster was intelligent enough to hold a grudge. It began using its bill-hooked horn to dig into the passage, scraping with its two forelegs and trying to reach for Carver with those enormous claws. Zavor couldn't see much from his position on the canyon floor, but he could see more indigo beams bounce off the beast's carapace with no ill effect. Then a concussive grenade rolled beneath its body, detonating up into its underbelly. That jarred the creature and drew its attention. The bellowing report of Riley's revolver came next, the heavy bullets cracking against the beetle rather than simply splashing off as the energy weapons had. It seemed that humanity's weapons, dismissed as brutal and primitive, were once again proving better suited for a brutal and primitive world. While Riley kept the beast's attention, two grappling hooks fired past it. The enormous Turnbull went nearly vertical, shooting steeply toward the upper edge of the canyon. LaSalle rode his line at an upward angle, detaching to land on the beetle's back, where he withdrew and extended the spear that had been attached to his own back. The enormous insectoid charged Riley for the dual purpose of attacking its aggressor and shaking off the tiny thing on its back. LaSalle planted his spear between the elytra, wedging the weapon between the beetle's vestigial wings as a sort of anchor. Once again proving that he was insane, the captain fired his grappling hook through the monster's legs and zipped beneath its underbelly before the beetle could claw or bite him. He detached his grapple, already running, and reloaded his behemoth of a pistol.
"That's right, come on, you bitch!"
he grunted to himself, audible over the communications band. Another volley of heavy pistol fire distracted the monster from the little thing on its back that had not yet done anything harmful, and it lunged for Riley once again.
"Hurry it up, LaSalle!"
There was a tinge of desperation in the captain's voice while he sprinted backward as best he could manage. Straining the movement-assisting servos in his armor, LaSalle used his spear as a lever to wrench up the beetle's elytron and expose a gossamer wing, seemingly vestigial, resting over softer flesh. While one hand held up the plate, the other drove the spear as deeply as it could sink, sinking a few good inches and then letting the elytron fall back down to cover the spear. The elytron rested awkwardly on the protrusion, instinctively trying not to fold or shut entirely. After zip-tying a grenade to the spear, LaSalle fired his grappling hook and leapt off of the monster's back.
"It's in place!"
Riley grunted behind his faceplate.
"Fuck it, we do it again."
This time, he fired the grappling hook over the beetle's head to keep its attention, taking several potshots at the creature while he sailed over it. The thing whipped its enormous horn at him and nearly caught the captain, smashing into his leg and drawing a bellow of pain, but he still made it past. As the beetle turned to give chase once again, Turnbull was beating his enormous bulk against a stone. The big man overtaxed the servos in his armor.
"Come on!"
he grunted in his deep basso.
"Come on!"
With agonizing slowness, the vehicle-sized slab of rock began to move, creeping over the edge of the canyon wall. It plummeted downward, and Turnbull bellowed, feeling like a caveman who'd just dropped a stone on a mammoth. The comparison was apt. The enormous rock hurtled downward and slammed into the beetle's back, forcing its elytron fully closed and thereby driving the spear deeper than any human arm could have managed. The breaching charge and grenade detonated, and the insectoid let out a desperate human-like bellow one last time, oddly chunky orange blood spraying from its jagged maw. It staggered forward, driven solely by spite, trying to punish those who had slain it. The beetle's rear legs gave out, then more, until it was dragging itself by its forelegs. Finally, it collapsed, its horn inches from the captain. From her hiding place, better known as the hole where LaSalle shoved her, Bagheera emerged with her still pleasantly booping little device.
The Earthblood appears to still be intact,
she squawked. The Dithrian planted a flashing beacon.
We can extract once we have a full team to guard against scavengers.
Not to mention,
Carver rasped as he emerged from the canyon offshoot, helping Zavor stagger along.
We need to get Red back to medical. You too, Cap. I saw that hit you took. You don't want to end up like me.
Blearily, Zavor looked between LaSalle, Riley, and Turnbull.
How did you do all that anyway?
He asked in his low growl. LaSalle fielded the answer.
Humanity is the apex predator on Earth. Even before we had guns and bombs, we were pack hunters. We figure out how to outsmart the animals, beat them with the environment. The whole planet is our claws, our teeth, our crushing jaws. I'll second you on the crushing part,
boomed Turnbull, laughing. Carver spoke up next.
Well, Flowery, LaSalle is right. We're downright tiny compared to many of the animals on our planet, but we were the apex predators even before gunpowder was invented. To humans, a bigger monster is just a bigger target.
He hefted Zavor over his shoulder again.
Now let's get you to the bow and send out some engineers to get our ship fixed.
I hope you enjoyed that story. Click right here to watch another video with the same characters.